Every parent knows that moment when a child's tears break your heart in ways you never expected. For Tomás Rivera, that moment came when two orphaned children appeared on his doorstep, asking if they could sleep somewhere safe for just one night. 11-year-old Iris and her younger brother Theo had been kicked out of their orphanage for defending another child. They had nowhere to go. Tomás was a widowed father, barely managing his own twin daughters after losing his wife. His world was already falling apart, but something about these two children touched his heart. He let them stay for one night. Then one night became a week became a month. Soon, 5 broken people were learning to become a family. They shared meals, bedtime stories, and slowly healed each other's wounds. But when the authorities came to take the children away, would their new bond be strong enough to survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the weathered shingles of Millbrook like a gentle embrace, wrapping the small coastal town in the kind of silence that speaks of both solitude and sanctuary. Here, where the Atlantic whispered its ancient stories against granite cliffs, time moved differently, not rushed by the demands of cities, but measured in tides and seasons, in the patient rhythm of waves that had carved these shores for centuries. Tomás Rivera had chosen this place 3 years ago precisely for its embrace of the unhurried. The cottage on Maple Street, with its crooked mailbox and paint-chipped shutters, had called to something deep within him, need for simplicity, after the complexity of loss had nearly undone him. The realtor had apologized for the house's imperfections, the front step that sagged slightly to the left, the kitchen window that required a firm hand to close, the way the floorboards creaked a morning greeting in the hallway. But Tomás had seen something else entirely. He had seen possibility wrapped in worn wood and weathered stone. The cottage breathed with the memory of the woman who had made it home. Maria's presence lingered in every corner, not as a ghost, but as a gentle influence that had shaped their daily rhythms. Her recipe box still commanded its place of honor on the kitchen counter, a wooden treasure chest filled with index cards, bearing her careful handwriting. Each card was a small masterpiece of Lovenot, just ingredients and measurements, but margin notes that revealed her heart. "Add extra vanilla when the girls are sad," she had written on her pancake recipe. "Tomás likes this with coffee on Sunday mornings," adorned her cinnamon roll instructions. The kitchen itself had become the soul of their small family. The round oak table, scarred by years of homework sessions and art projects, could seat 4 comfortably, though. Maria had always insisted it could stretch to accommodate anyone who needed a place. The morning light streamed through gingham curtains she had sewn by hand, casting warm squares of gold across the worn linoleum floor. A mason jar filled with wildflowers usually graced the center of the table, a tradition Maria had started and Tomás had faithfully continued, even when grief made such gestures feel impossibly heavy. Sofia and Elena Rivera, 8 years old and as different as summer and winter, had learned to navigate their world with the particular grace that comes to children who have faced loss too early. Sofia, older by 12 minutes and never letting Elena forget it, possessed her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet strength. She approached life with a methodical precision that sometimes startled adults, organizing her school supplies with military efficiency, reading 3 grade levels above her peers, and maintaining a small garden behind the house where she grew the herbs their mother had once tended. Elena, fair-haired and quick to laughter, carried her mother's spirit of spontaneity wrapped in her father's gentle heart. Where Sofia planned, Elena improvised. Where Sofia studied, Elena explored. Yet beneath their differences lay an unshakable bond, forged not just by shared genetics, but by shared grief. They had held each other through the long nights after Maria's death, had learned together to navigate a world that suddenly felt too large and too empty. Their father's transformation had been perhaps the most profound. Tomás Rivera, once a man whose laughter could fill a room, had become a careful guardian of routines and quiet moments. At 42, his dark hair was already threading silver at the temples, not from age, Maria used to tease, but from the worry lines that came with loving deeply. His hands, calloused from years of carpentry, moved with the same precision whether he was crafting a cabinet or braiding his daughter's hair for school. The morning ritual had become sacred in their household. Tomás would rise before dawn, his internal clock attuned to the rhythm of responsibility that had replaced the luxury of spontaneous sleep. The coffee would brew while he stood at the kitchen window, watching the harbour come alive with the gentle ballet of fishing boats heading out to meet the sunrise. By the time Sophia's alarm clock announced the official start of their day, the smell of breakfast would already be weaving through the house, usually something from Maria's recipe box, prepared with the devotion of a man who understood that feeding his children was about far more than nutrition. The girls had adapted to this routine with the resilience that children possess in abundance. They would stumble into the kitchen, sleep-tousled and reaching for each other's hands before their feet fully found the floor, a habit that had begun the night after the funeral and had never been broken. Sophia would immediately check the weather through the window, already planning her day with the thoroughness of a small general. Elena would curl into her father's arms for their morning hug, a ritual that grounded them both for whatever challenges the day might bring. Millbrook Elementary School sat just 6 blocks from their cottage, a red brick building that had educated 3 generations of local children. The walk each morning took them past Mrs. Chen's flower garden, where the elderly woman would wave from her porch swing and call out weather predictions that were uncannily accurate. Past Henderson's market, where old Mr. Henderson would tap the window and point to the penny candy display if the girls had been particularly good that week. Past the harbour, where the fishing boats would be heading out or coming in, depending on the tides and the season. The school itself had become a second sanctuary for the Rivera family. Principal Davies, a kind man in his 60s who had known Maria since her own school days, kept a gentle watch over the girls. Their teachers, Mrs. Patterson and Miss Rodriguez, had learned to navigate the delicate balance of maintaining normalcy while acknowledging that these children carried burdens that were far from normal. Tomás's workshop occupied the converted garage behind the house, a space that hummed with the quiet industry of a craftsman who took pride in work done well. The smell of sawdust and wood stain had become as familiar to the girls as their mother's perfume once had been. Here, surrounded by tools that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, Tomás created pieces that would outlast their maker's kitchen tables, that would host family dinners for decades, bookshelves that would hold the dreams and stories of generations, rocking chairs that would comfort countless children through sleepless nights. His reputation in Millbrook had grown quietly but steadily. Neighbors would stop by with projects both small and large, and Tomás would listen with the patience of a man who understood that sometimes people needed more than furniture repaired. They needed someone to care about the stories their possessions held. Mrs. Chen's dining room set had been her grandmother's. The Hendersons' porch swing had been where old Mr. Henderson had proposed to his late wife. Each project carried its own history, its own importance, and Tomás approached them all with the reverence they deserved. The evenings in the Rivera household followed their own gentle rhythm. Homework would be completed at the kitchen table while Tomás prepared dinner, Sophia's methodical approach contrasting with Elena's more creative interpretations of arithmetic. They would eat together, sharing the events of their day with the deliberate attention of people who had learned not to take such moments for granted. After dinner, there would be baths and story time, with Tomás reading from the collection of books that had grown to fill 2 tall shelves in the living room. Bedtime brought its own rituals. Sophia required 3 stories and would negotiate for a 4th with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Elena needed her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, positioned just so, and the nightlight angled to cast friendly shadows rather than scary ones. Both girls required the promise that Tomás would check on them before he went to sleep, a promise he had never broken, not once in the 3 years since Maria's death. The house would settle into evening quiet, and Tomás would find himself in the kitchen, sometimes with a cup of coffee, sometimes with Maria's recipe box open before him. He would read her notes in the margins, her suggestions for modifications, her reminders about the girl's preferences. These moments were both painful and precious, a way of maintaining connection with the woman who had made their house a home. Mrs. Chen next door had become an unofficial grandmother to the girls, her own children grown and scattered across the country. She had a way of appearing just when help was needed, with a plate of cookies when homework was particularly challenging, with offers to watch the girls when Tomás had to work late, with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from having lived through many seasons of joy and sorrow. The town itself embraced the Rivera family with the particular warmth that small communities reserve for their own. At Henderson's Market, the girls could charge small purchases to their father's account with nothing more than a smile and a promise to be good. At the library, Mrs. Thornton would set aside new books that she thought they might enjoy. At the harbour, the fishermen would wave and sometimes share stories of the day's catch, treating Sophia and Elena like the neighborhood treasures they had become. Yet beneath this surface of routine and community support, Tomás carried the weight of single parenthood with the careful attention of a man who understood that his daughters had already lost one parent and could not afford to lose another to neglect or inattention. Every decision was measured against the question of what would be best for Sophia and Elena. Every choice was filtered through the lens of responsibility that had become both his burden and his purpose. The cottage on Maple Street, with its crooked mailbox and paint-chipped shutters, had become more than just shelter. It had become the foundation upon which 3 lives were slowly rebuilding themselves, one day at a time, one shared meal at a time, one bedtime story at a time. It was a place where grief was acknowledged but not allowed to rule, where love was practiced in the small daily acts of caring for one another, where hope was cultivated like the herbs in Sophia's garden patiently, carefully, with faith in tomorrow's possibilities. This was the world that Tomás Rivera had created for his daughters, a world of routine and safety, of community and quiet contentment. It was a world that had taken 3 years to establish, 3 years to make feel solid and secure. It was a world that was about to be changed forever by 2 children with nowhere else to go, carrying everything they owned in a tattered suitcase, standing on his front porch with hope as their only currency and desperation as their only guide. The disciplinary report lay on Director Harwick's desk like a death sentence, its official letterhead stark against the mahogany surface. 2 names were typed in black ink: Iris Caldwell, age 11, and Theodore Caldwell, age 9. The infraction was listed as physical altercation with fellow residents, insubordination toward staff, and general disruption of facility order. What the report didn't capture was the sound of 6-year-old Marcus crying in the dormitory bathroom, or the way his small shoulders shook as 3 older boys cornered him, demanding his dessert money. Iris had heard it first. She always heard it first, protective instinct honed by years of standing between the world's cruelties and her younger brother. The crying had pulled her from her own bed, where she'd been helping Theo with his reading homework, their textbooks spread across the thin blanket that served as their entire private world in the crowded dormitory. "Stay here," she had whispered to Theo, but he had already closed his book and swung his legs over the side of the bed. Where Iris went, Theo followed. It was a law as unchangeable as gravity in their small universe. The scene in the bathroom had been depressingly familiar. Marcus, small for his age and still new enough to the orphanage to believe that adults would help him, pressed against the cold tile wall, while Danny Kowalski and his 2 followers demanded not just his money, but his dignity. These were the moments that revealed the true nature of Millbrook Children's Homenote, the sanitized version presented to potential adoptive families during visiting hours, but the Lord of the Flies reality that emerged when the adults looked away. "Leave him alone," Iris had said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years being the adult in situations where adults had failed. She stood in the doorway, all 90 pounds of fierce determination, with Theo flanking her like a loyal lieutenant. Danny had laughed, the sound echoing off the bathroom tiles. At 13, he had the advantage of size and the particular cruelty that comes to children who have been shown too little kindness for too long. "Mind your own business, Caldwell. This doesn't concern you." But Marcus's tears had made it her business. In the arithmetic of survival that governed their world, protecting the vulnerable was both a luxury they couldn't afford and a responsibility they couldn't abandon. Iris had learned long ago that sometimes the right choice and the safe choice were mutually exclusive. "I said leave him alone." This time, she had stepped fully into the bathroom, Theo moving with her like they were connected by invisible threads. The confrontation had escalated with the inevitability of thunder following lightning. Danny had shoved Marcus harder against the wall, his message clear. Iris had responded by grabbing Danny's wrist and twisting it away from the smaller boy. Theo had positioned himself between Marcus and Danny's friends, his young face set with determination that would have been admirable in any other context. The fight had been brief but decisive. Iris, despite her smaller size, possessed the desperate strength of someone with everything to lose. She had learned to fight not from anger, but from necessity, and she fought with the efficiency of someone who understood that mercy was often mistaken for weakness. Theo had held his ground, his presence more deterrent than threat, but enough to keep the other boys from overwhelming his sister. It had ended with Danny on the bathroom floor, his nose bloody and his pride devastated. Marcus had stopped crying, his tears replaced by the wide-eyed amazement that comes with witnessing justice delivered by unlikely heroes. The other boys had backed away, suddenly aware that the Caldwell siblings were not the easy targets they had appeared to be. The aftermath had been swift and merciless. Mrs. Patterson, the night supervisor, had arrived to find Danny claiming victimhood and Iris standing over him with knuckles scraped raw from contact with his face. The truth had mattered less than the appearance of disorder. In an institution built on the promise of control, any disruption was seen as a failure of the system, and failures required consequences. Director Harwick had made his decision before Iris and Theo had even been brought to his office. The Caldwell siblings had been problems from the day they arrived 2 years ago, too independent, too protective of each other, too willing to question authority when authority proved itself unworthy of respect. This incident had simply provided the excuse he needed to solve what he considered the problem of their influence on the other children. "You've exhausted your opportunities here," he had said, not looking up from the paperwork he was completing. "Millbrook Children's Home cannot continue to house residents who demonstrate violent tendencies and disrespect for our rules." Iris had tried to explain, her words careful and respectful, despite the injustice burning in her chest. She had described Marcus's tears, Danny's threats, the pattern of bullying that the staff either ignored or actively enabled. But Harwick had dismissed her explanations with the wave of a man who had already made up his mind. "Your version of events is irrelevant," he had said. "The fact remains that you initiated physical violence against another resident. That behavior is unacceptable, regardless of your justifications." Theo had spoken for the first time since entering the office. "What about Marcus? Who's going to protect him?" The question had hung in the air like an accusation, highlighting the fundamental failure of the system they were being expelled from. Harwick had not answered because there was no good answer. Marcus would continue to be vulnerable, and children like Danny would continue to prey on that vulnerability, and the cycle would continue unbroken. "You have 1 hour to collect your belongings," Harwick had said finally. "A taxi will take you to the bus station, where you'll be provided with tickets to the state facility in Portland. They've been notified of your transfer." The state facility. Iris had heard the older children whisper about it in the dormitory after lights out. Stories of overcrowding, understaffing, and the kind of institutional neglect that made Millbrook Children's Home seem like a luxury resort by comparison. It was where children went when they had exhausted all other options, where the pretense of finding forever families was abandoned in favor of simple warehousing until age 18. The packing had taken less than the allotted hour. Their possessions fit easily into the tattered suitcase that had traveled with them from placement to placementa. A few changes of clothes, some books that Iris had managed to keep despite multiple moves, Theo's collection of small stones that he gathered from each place they lived. The suitcase itself had been their father's, one of the few tangible connections to the parents they barely remembered. Its corners were reinforced with duct tape, and its handle had been wrapped in cloth to prevent the sharp edges from cutting their hands. But as they sat in the taxi, heading toward what felt like another kind of ending, Iris had made a decision that would change everything. The bus tickets to Portland lay in her pocket, unused. Instead, she had asked the driver to stop at the first residential street. They came to a quiet neighborhood where houses sat behind white picket fences and mailboxes proclaimed the names of families who had chosen each other. "Are you sure about this?" Theo had asked as they stood on the sidewalk, their suitcase between them and the weight of uncertainty ahead of them. Iris had looked down the street, her eyes settling on a cottage with paint-chipped shutters and a crooked mailbox that somehow looked more welcoming than threatening. Warm light glowed from the windows, and she could smell something wonderful drifting from somewhere inside, the scent of home cooking and the promise of kindness. "We're not going to Portland," she had said, picking up their suitcase and starting toward the cottage. "We're going to find somewhere that wants us." It was a plan born of desperation and hope in equal measure, the kind of decision that children make when they understand that adults have failed them completely. As they walked up the path toward the front door, Iris rehearsed the words she would say, the explanation she would offer, the plea she would make. Behind them, the taxi disappeared around the corner, taking with it their tickets to the state facility and any possibility of retreat. Ahead of them lay the unknown, represented by a simple front door and the hope that someone, somewhere, might believe that two children who had fought for justice deserved justice in return. The disciplinary report that had started their exile would eventually be filed away in some bureaucratic drawer, forgotten by everyone except the two children whose lives it had changed forever. But standing on that front porch, with everything they owned in a single suitcase and everything they hoped for in their hearts, Iris and Theo Caldwell were about to discover that sometimes the end of one story is simply the beginning of another. The kitchen had never held 5 people for breakfast before. Tomás stood at the stove, spatula in hand, watching pancakes bubble and thinking about how quickly the familiar could become foreign. The round oak table that had comfortably seated his family of 3 now felt crowded, with Sophia and Elena pressed close together on one side, while Iris and Theo sat somewhat stiffly on the other, as if prepared to bolt at the first sign of rejection. Theo's hand-drawn map lay beside his orange juice glass, a childish sketch on notebook paper that he had worked on after everyone else had gone to sleep. The map showed Maple Street in careful pencil lines, with each house labeled in his 9-year-old handwriting. Mrs. Chennis Lady with flowers, Henderson's Storepenny Candy, and at the center, marked with a careful star, Tomás's house-safe place. The map represented something profound to Theo, though he couldn't articulate it yet. For the first time in his young life, he was trying to learn a place rather than simply survive it. The other homes, the other temporary arrangements, had always been endured rather than embraced. But this house, with its creaking floorboards and the smell of coffee that lingered in the morning air, felt different. "So," Tomás said, sliding pancakes onto plates, "we should probably talk about how this is going to work." Iris straightened, her shoulders tensing. She had heard these conversations before, the discussions about rules and expectations that usually preceded explanations about why their stay would be ending sooner rather than later. Her hand moved instinctively to rest on Theo's shoulder, a gesture so automatic that she wasn't conscious of making it. "We won't be any trouble," she said quickly. "We can share the couch. We don't eat much, and we're very quiet." Sophia looked across the table at this girl, who was only 3 years older than herself, but who spoke with the careful diplomacy of someone much older. "Why do you talk like that?" she asked with the directness that 8-year-olds wield like a superpower. "Like what?" Like you're trying to convince someone not to send you away. The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. Elena, sensing the weight of the moment, reached across the table and touched Iris's hand with fingers still sticky from syrup. "We're not going to send you away," she said with the absolute certainty that children possess about things they cannot possibly guarantee. Tomás set down the spatula and looked at the 4 children around his table. Sophia, with her mother's dark eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin, was studying the newcomers with the analytical precision she applied to everything. Elena, fair-haired and generous-hearted, had already claimed Iris and Theo as siblings in the way that children decide such things quickly and completely. And the Caldwell siblings sat like refugees who had learned not to trust shelter, even when it was freely offered. "Nobody's getting sent anywhere," Tomás said, settling into his own chair. "But we need to figure out how to make this work for everyone." The conversation that followed was unlike any that had taken place in the Rivera household before. Rules that had been unspoken when there were only 3 of them suddenly needed clarification. The bathroom schedule, previously a matter of natural rotation, now required actual coordination. Chores that had been divided between 2 children now needed to accommodate 4. But it was more than logistics. It was the delicate dance of personalities, learning to coexist in a space that had been carefully balanced for a different configuration. Sophia's methodical approach to morning routines clashed with Iris's hyper-vigilant need to be ready for anything at any moment. Elena's casual sharing of toys and clothes made Theo nervous. Had learned that possessions were temporary, and sharing often meant losing. "I could help with your carpentry," Theo offered, when the conversation turned to contributions he and Iris could make to the household. His eagerness was heartbreaking in its transparency. This was a child who had learned that usefulness was often the price of acceptance. Tomás looked at this 9-year-old boy who was trying so hard to prove his worth. "Have you done carpentry before?" "No, sir, but I'm good with my hands. And I learned fast, and I promise I won't break anything expensive." The "sir" hit Tomás like a small punch to the chest. His own daughters had never called him sir, had never felt the need to maintain such formal distance from the man who was supposed to protect them. It was a reminder of the different worlds these children came, from worlds where respect was demanded rather than earned, where safety was conditional rather than assumed. "Just Tomás," he said gently, "and yes, you can help in the workshop, but because you're interested, not because you owe me anything." The relief in Theo's face was profound. For the first time since arriving, his shoulders dropped from their defensive hunch, and something like a smile ghosted across his features. Iris watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read adult moods for signs of changing weather. This man Tomás was different from the others they had encountered. He didn't speak with the institutional authority that had characterized most of the adults in their lives. He didn't make promises with the casual indifference of someone who wouldn't be held accountable for keeping them. But Iris had learned to trust slowly and suspect quickly. Kindness, in her experience, often came with strings attached. "What about school?" she asked, the question carrying layers of practical concern. School enrollment required paperwork, documentation, legal guardianship, things that their current situation couldn't provide. "Principal Davies is an old friend," Tomás said. "He'll work with us to get you both enrolled. You'll be in the same school as Sophia and Elena." The idea of attending school with children who might become their siblings was both thrilling and terrifying. Iris had attended 7 different schools in the past 5 years. She had learned to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention that might lead to questions about her home situation. But invisibility would be impossible when everyone knew she was living with the Rivera family. Sophia had been quiet during most of the breakfast conversation, but now she spoke up. "Will you tell people they're our siblings?" It was a complicated question from an 8-year-old who was still processing the sudden expansion of her family. Sophia wasn't resistant to sharing her father and her home, but she was protective of the identity she had carefully constructed as half of the Rivera twins. Adding 2 more children to their family dynamic would change everything about how others saw them, how they saw themselves. "They are our siblings," Elena said with the firmness of someone who had already decided the matter. "Right, Daddy?" Tomás looked around the table at 4 children who were navigating relationships that had no clear precedent. Sophia and Elena had never had to share their father's attention with anyone other than each other. Iris and Theo had never experienced adults who seemed genuinely interested in their well-being rather than simply their compliance. "Family is more than biology," he said finally. "It's about choosing to take care of each other, about showing up even when it's hard. If that's what we're doing here, then yes, you're siblings." The word hung in the air like a benediction. Siblings. Not foster children, not temporary guests, not charity cases. Siblings. Theo picked up his hand-drawn map and added something to it carefully, drawing a line that connected their house to the school, labeling it "the way Sophia and Elena and Iris and me go to school." It was a small addition, but it represented a seismic shift in how he saw his place in the world. For the first time, he was planning for tomorrow rather than simply surviving today. After breakfast, the logistics of integration began in earnest. Iris and Theo's few possessions were unpacked and distributed between Sophia and Elena's rooms, the girls sharing with the generous abandon of children who had never known scarcity. Iris was given half of Sophia's dresser and a corner of the bookshelf for her small collection of novels. Theo's stones found a place on Elena's windowsill, each one carefully positioned to catch the morning light. The process was not without friction. When Iris instinctively began making both beds with military precision, Sophia felt criticized for her own more casual approach to room maintenance. When Theo accidentally knocked over Elena's collection of tiny ceramic animals, he nearly cried with the terror of someone who had been punished harshly for smaller infractions. But they worked through it with the patience of people who recognized that they were building something important together. Tomás watched from the doorway as 4 children slowly learned each other's rhythms, each other's needs, each other's fears. Mrs. Chen appeared at the kitchen door, just as they were finishing the room arrangements, her arms full of fresh-baked muffins and her eyes bright with curiosity. "I thought I heard extra voices this morning," she said, her gaze taking in Iris and Theo with the sharp assessment of someone who had raised 5 children of her own. "And unless Sophia and Elena learned to harmonize overnight, I'm guessing we have some new neighbors." The introductions were made with the careful politeness that children use when they're not sure of their ground. But Mrs. Chen had a gift for putting children at ease, and within minutes she had coaxed smiles from both Iris and Theo. "That map is very good," she told Theo, studying his artwork with genuine interest. "Though you missed the best part of my garden, raspberry bushes behind the house. Maybe tomorrow you can help me pick some berries for pie." It was a small invitation, but it carried enormous weight. Tomorrow. The promise of continuity, of a future that included him, of belonging that extended beyond the walls of the Rivera cottage. As Mrs. Chen left, pressing the last muffin into Theo's hands, Iris found herself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her brother interact with Elena and Sophia as they planned their raspberry-picking expedition. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Theo looked like what he was, 9-year-old boy excited about berries and pie and tomorrow's possibilities. The map he had drawn now seemed prophetic rather than hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally found their place on it. The friendship bracelet was nothing more than 3 strands of colored yarn braided together, but in the complex social mathematics of childhood, it represented a peace treaty, a declaration of solidarity, and a bridge across the uncertain waters of new family dynamics. Iris had made it during the quiet hour after dinner, her fingers working with the patient precision of someone who understood that small gestures could carry enormous weight. Elena had been struggling with the bathroom schedule that morning, frustrated by having to wait for Iris to finish braiding her hair, upset by the way her usual routine had been disrupted by the addition of 2 more people to their morning choreography. The complaints had been small, muttered under her breath rather than shouted, but Iris had heard them with the hypersensitive hearing of someone who had learned to monitor adult moods for signs of changing tolerance. "I made this for you," Iris had said, after Elena emerged from her bath, pink-cheeked and wrapped in a towel that was still warm from the dryer. The bracelet dangled from her fingers like an offering. Elena had accepted it with the solemnity that 8-year-olds reserve for gifts that they recognize as significant. She had held it up to the light, admiring the way the colors wove together, before extending her wrist for Iris to tie it on. "It's beautiful," she had said, and meant it. But more than beautiful, it was a promise that they could figure out how to share space and time and attention, that the growing pains of becoming siblings were temporary, that the effort was worth making. The bracelet had sparked a small revolution in the Rivera household. Sophia, not to be outdone, had spent the evening teaching Theo how to make origami cranes from pages of old magazines. Theo had responded by showing both girls how to skip stones at the harbor, a skill he had learned during their brief stay with a foster family who lived near a lake. These small exchanges were the currency of relationship building, each gesture adding weight to the fragile structure they were constructing together. But the process was not without its setbacks. The first real crisis had come on a Thursday morning when Sophia discovered that her favorite sweater-the-blue cardigan that had been their mother's was missing from her dresser drawer. The sweater had been more than clothing. It had been a tangible connection to Maria, something Sophia wore on days when she particularly missed her mother's presence. "Where is it?" Sophia had asked, her voice tight with the kind of panic that comes when something irreplaceable goes missing. Iris had been sitting at the kitchen table, helping Theo with his math homework, when Sophia's distress had filled the room like smoke. The accusation had been unspoken, but clear the new children had taken something that didn't belong to them. "We didn't touch your sweater," Iris had said, her own voice careful and controlled, despite the hurt that flickered across her features. She had spent years being blamed for things she hadn't done, and the familiar weight of suspicion settled on her shoulders like an old, unwelcome coat. Tomás had found the sweater 20 minutes later, folded in the laundry basket, waiting to be put away. The crisis had been resolved, but the damage had been done. Sophia had retreated into guilty silence, and Iris had withdrawn into the protective shell that she wore when the world proved itself untrustworthy. It had been Elena who had bridged the gap, her friendship bracelet catching the light as she moved between her sister and Iris with the diplomatic skills of someone who had learned to navigate family tensions with grace. "Sophia gets scared when she can't find Mama's things," Elena had explained to Iris while they sat on the front porch swing, watching Theo help Tomás measure boards in the workshop. "It's not about you, it's about missing Mama." The explanation had unlocked something in Iris's understanding. She had been so focused on proving that she and Theo deserved to stay that she had missed the ways in which their presence was disrupting carefully established coping mechanisms. Sophia's methodical organization wasn't just personality, it was how she maintained control in a world that had already taken away her mother. "I miss my mama too," Iris had said quietly. "I don't remember her very well, but I miss having one." It was the first time she had acknowledged her own loss, the first crack in the armor of competence she wore to protect herself and Theo. Elena had reached over and touched the friendship bracelet on her wrist, and somehow the gesture had contained all the comfort that words couldn't provide. The real breakthrough had come that weekend when Tomás announced they were going to the beach for a tide pool expedition. It was a Rivera family tradition, something they had done with Maria and had continued after her death as a way of maintaining connection to happier times. The beach at Millbrook was rocky rather than sandy, with granite formations that created natural pools when the tide retreated. These pools became temporary aquariums filled with sea anemones, hermit crabs, and small fish trapped by the ocean's withdrawal. Iris had approached the expedition with the cautious enthusiasm of someone who had learned not to expect good things to last. She addressed Theo in layers, packed extra snacks in case they got hungry, and mentally prepared herself for the possibility that something would go wrong and they would need to leave early. But the beach had worked its ancient magic on all of them. Theo had discovered a hermit crab that he named Fernando and spent an hour following it from pool to pool, narrating its adventures with the boundless imagination of childhood. Sophia had found a perfect sand dollar and had immediately given it to Iris, explaining that guests should get the best treasures. Elena had shrieked with delight when a small fish had brushed against her fingers, then spent 20 minutes trying to recreate the experience. Tomás had watched his expanded family explore the tide pools with the satisfaction of someone who had made a decision that was proving itself correct. These children belonged together, not because of biology or paperwork, but because of the way they naturally fell into caring for each other. The day had been marked by small revelations. Iris had a gift for finding creatures hiding in the deepest pools, her patient observation skills revealing wonders that the others might have missed. Theo had an instinctive gentleness with the sea life, handling even the most delicate anemones with careful reverence. Sophia had shared her extensive knowledge of marine biology with the generous authority of someone who loved learning and loved teaching even more. Elena had provided a soundtrack of wonder and delight that had made every discovery seem magical. But it was the moment when a rogue wave had soaked them all that had truly cemented their bond. Instead of the tears and complaints that Tomás had expected, the children had dissolved into laughter, the kind of helpless, joyful laughter that comes when surprise turns into shared adventure rather than shared misery. They had driven home in wet clothes, the car filled with the smell of salt air and the comfortable chatter of children who had stopped being strangers to each other. Iris had braided Elena's damp hair, while Sophia had shown Theo how to preserve the sea glass they had collected in a small jar. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table sharing a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup comfort food for a day that had been comfortable in all the right ways, Elena had held up her friendship bracelet and made an all the right haze announcement. "We should all have them," she had said, "friendship bracelets, so people know we're a family." The project had consumed the evening. Iris had taught them all the basic braiding technique, while Sophia had contributed her organizational skills to manage the different colored yarns. Theo had added his own innovation, weaving in small beads that caught the light. Tomás had accepted his bracelet with the bemused grace of a father who had learned that sometimes the most meaningful gifts come from the smallest hands. By bedtime, they all wore matching bracelets not identical, because each child had chosen their own color combinations, but recognizably part of a set. The bracelets would fade and fray over time, but they had served their purpose. They had marked the moment when 5 people had stopped being strangers sharing a house and had started being a family sharing a home. As Iris tucked Theo into his bed in Elena's room, she noticed that he had added another detail to his hand-drawn map. In careful letters, he had written "Family Beach" with an arrow pointing toward the shore. Below it, he had drawn 5 stick figures holding hands at the water's edge. "Do you think we can stay?" he whispered, the question carrying all the hope and fear that had been building in both of them since they first knocked on Tomás's door. Iris looked at the friendship bracelet on her wrist, at the sea glass gleaming in its jar on the windowsill, at the way Elena had naturally shifted to make room for Theo in her bed without being asked. "I think we're already staying," she whispered back. And for the first time since their parents had died, Iris allowed herself to believe that home might be something more than a temporary arrangement between one loss and the next. The wooden bird carving was no bigger than Theo's thumb, but Tomás had spent 3 evenings working on it by lamplight after the children had gone to bed. The robin sat in perfect miniature detail, its breast carved to suggest the roundness of spring, its head tilted in the alert pose of a creature listening for the first sounds of dawn. When he pressed it into Theo's palm that Saturday morning, the boy's eyes had widened with the particular wonder that comes with receiving something made specifically for you. "For me?" Theo had asked, as if the concept of gifts without occasion was still foreign to him. "For you," Tomás had confirmed. "I noticed you like birds, and this one reminded me of how you watch everything so carefully." The robin had been inspired by Theo's habit of standing at the kitchen window each morning, cataloguing the birds that visited Mrs. Chen's feeders. He would name them quietly to himself, the cardinal family that arrived promptly at 7, the blue jays that bullied their way to the best seeds, the tiny wrens that darted in and out like feathered acrobats. It was a ritual that spoke to his deep need to understand his environment, to find patterns and safety in the predictable rhythms of the natural world. But the carving represented more than Tomás's observation of Theo's interests. It was a promise of spring, of new beginnings, of the faith that even the harshest winters eventually give way to renewal. It was the kind of gift that fathers give to sons, loaded with meaning that wouldn't be fully understood until years later. The weeks since their arrival had settled into something resembling routine, though it was a routine that required constant adjustment, as 5 people learned to move through shared space without stepping on each other's needs. The morning bathroom schedule had been refined to military precision, with each child allocated specific time slots and backup plans for emergencies. The kitchen table had been expanded with a folding card table that Tomás had rescued from the garage, creating enough space for homework, art projects, and the general detritus of a household that had doubled in size overnight. School had presented its own challenges and revelations. Principal Davies had welcomed Iris and Theo with the practiced kindness of an educator who had seen every variation of family crisis, but their integration into the established social ecosystem had been more complex. Iris, placed in 5th grade despite her academic abilities that suggested she could handle more advanced work, had approached her studies with the focused intensity of someone who understood that education was often the only reliable path out of circumstances beyond her control. Her teacher, Mrs. Rudry Harrison, had quickly recognized that this was a child who read voraciously, wrote with unexpected sophistication, and approached every assignment as if her future depended on it, which, in Iris's mind, it probably did. The other children had been initially curious about the girl who lived with the Rivera twins, but Iris's natural reserve and protective instincts had kept most potential friendships at arm's length. Theo's experience in 3rd grade had been different but equally revealing. His teacher, Mr. Peterson, had discovered a child with an intuitive understanding of mathematics that contrasted sharply with his struggles in reading comprehension. But more than his academic profile, Theo's gentle nature and instinctive kindness had made him popular with his classmates in a way that surprised him. For a boy who had spent years learning to be invisible in institutional settings, the experience of being genuinely liked was both thrilling and terrifying. He would come home from school with stories of playground friendships and lunch table conversations, his face bright with the particular joy of someone discovering that he was worthy of casual affection. Sophia had watched her new brother's social success with a mixture of pride and confusion. She had always been the serious twin, the one who preferred books to playground politics, who found comfort in routine rather than adventure. Seeing Theo navigate social situations with apparent ease had forced her to confront her own tendency toward isolation. Elena, meanwhile, had claimed the role of family ambassador with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found a project worthy of her considerable social energy. She had taken it upon herself to explain the Caldwell siblings to anyone who would listen, creating elaborate backstories that cast their arrival as a fairy tale rescue rather than a bureaucratic failure. "They're our chosen siblings," she would announce to anyone who questioned the family dynamics. "Daddy says the best families are the ones where people choose each other." The phrase had become Elena's standard explanation, and it had the virtue of being both true and sufficiently mysterious to discourage further questioning. But it also represented a fundamental shift in how the Rivera family understood itself. They were no longer a family diminished by loss, but a family expanded by choice. The first parent-teacher conference had been a revelation for everyone involved. Tomás had arrived at the school prepared to advocate for 4 children instead of 2, his pockets filled with notes about learning styles and emotional needs. Mrs. Harrison had praised Iris's academic performance while gently suggesting that she might benefit from social activities that would help her connect with peers. Mr. Peterson had recommended advanced math tutoring for Theo, while noting that his empathy made him a natural leader among the younger children. But it was the moment when Sophia's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had referred to "your 4 children" that had truly marked the transition. The phrase had been spoken casually as a simple statement of fact, but it had carried the weight of official recognition. In the eyes of the school system, at least, they were a family of 6. The community's response had been largely positive, though not without complications. Mrs. Chen had immediately expanded her informal grandmothering to include Iris and Theo, teaching them her grandmother's techniques for growing herbs and sharing stories of her own childhood that helped them understand that displacement and resilience were part of the human experience. Mr. Henderson at the market had added their names to the Rivera family account without being asked. A gesture that had brought tears to Iris's eyes when she realized she could buy milk for the house without having to explain her temporary status. The fishermen at the harbor had begun including Theo in their casual morning conversations, treating him as a neighborhood fixture rather than a temporary visitor. But there had been whispers, 2 questions about proper procedures and legal requirements, concerns about whether Tomás was equipped to handle 4 children, speculation about the long-term viability of an arrangement that had begun as an emergency response to 2 desperate children on a doorstep. These concerns had reached Tomás through the careful diplomatic channels that small towns use to communicate sensitive information. Mrs. Patterson from the school had mentioned, almost casually, that some families were wondering about the official status of his expanded household. The librarian had asked, with studied innocence, whether he needed help navigating the foster care system. Even Mrs. Prosses Chen, despite her unwavering support, had gently suggested that he might want to consult with a lawyer to protect everyone involved. The financial reality had been impossible to ignore. 4 children required twice as much of everything: food, clothing, school supplies, medical care. Tomás's income as a freelance carpenter was adequate for 3 people living modestly, but it stretched thin when expanded to support 6. He had begun taking on additional projects, working longer hours in his shop, accepting jobs that required evening and weekend work. The children had noticed, of course. Iris had begun rationing her requests for school supplies, making her notebooks last longer than necessary and carefully sharpening pencils down to stubs before asking for new ones. Theo had started declining Elena's offers to share her snacks, claiming he wasn't hungry when his rumbling stomach suggested otherwise. It was Sophia who had finally addressed the elephant in the room with her characteristic directness. "Are we poor now?" she had asked one evening as they shared a dinner of rice and beans, a meal that was nutritious and filling, but clearly designed to stretch the grocery budget. Tomás had looked around the table at 4 children who were trying to pretend they hadn't all been wondering the same thing. "We're not poor," he had said carefully, "but we're learning to be more thoughtful about money. That's not a bad thing." The conversation that had followed had been a masterclass in age-appropriate financial literacy. Tomás had explained that families sometimes needed to make adjustments when their circumstances changed, that choosing to spend money on people you loved meant choosing not to spend it on other things, that being careful with resources was a sign of wisdom rather than poverty. But privately, he had begun to worry. The monthly expenses had increased by more than his income could sustain indefinitely. He had started to consider options. He didn't want to consider returning to the construction company that had laid him off after Maria's death, taking on commercial projects that would require him to travel, exploring government assistance programs that felt like admissions of failure. It was during this period of financial stress that the robin carving had taken on additional significance. Tomás had carved it not just as a gift for Theo, but as a reminder to himself that some investments couldn't be measured in dollars. The time he spent on the carving, the careful attention to detail, the joy in Theo's face when he received it, these were the kinds of returns that made every other sacrifice worthwhile. The carving had inspired a new tradition in the Rivera household. Theo had asked if he could learn to carve, and Tomás had set up a small workstation in the corner of his shop where the boy could practice with soft wood and child-safe tools. The lessons had become a daily ritual, 20 minutes after homework but before dinner, when Theo would work on his own small projects under Tomás's gentle guidance. The other children had gravitated toward the shop as well, drawn by the warm light and the comfortable rhythm of work being done with care. Sophia had claimed responsibility for organizing the tool inventory, creating detailed charts that tracked everything from sandpaper grades to wood stain colors. Eleanor had appointed herself the official sweep-up crew, taking pride in keeping the workspace clean and safe. Iris had been more hesitant to claim a role in the shop activities, but she had begun to hover in the doorway during the evening work sessions, watching the easy interaction between Tomás and the other children, with the careful attention of someone still learning to trust that good things could be permanent. It was Theo who had finally drawn her fully into the circle. Iris could help with the measuring. He had suggested one evening when Tomás was trying to cut precise angles for a bookshelf project. She's really good at math and she has steady hands. The suggestion had been made with the casual confidence of a brother advocating for his sister, but it had represented a profound shift in family dynamics. Theo was no longer simply following Iris's lead, he was creating opportunities for her to be included, to be valued, to be seen as someone with gifts, to offer rather than someone with needs to be met. Iris had accepted the invitation with characteristic caution, but her natural precision had made her an invaluable assistant. She could read measurements with accuracy, mark cutting lines with mathematical precision, and sand surfaces to a smoothness that impressed even Tomás's exacting standards. More importantly, the shop had become a place where conversations happened naturally, where the rhythm of shared work created space for the kinds of discussions that were difficult to have around the dinner table. It was while sanding a piece of maple that Iris had finally asked the question that had been haunting her since their arrival. What happens when they come looking for us? Tomás had paused in his work, recognizing the weight of the question. They, the authorities, the system, the bureaucracy that had expelled them from their previous placement, and would eventually notice their absence from the state facility where they were supposed to be living. "We'll figure it out when it happens," he had said, which was both honest and unsatisfying. But what if they make us leave? The question had hung in the air like sawdust, settling over all of them with the weight of inevitable consequences, because Iris was right to worry. Their current arrangement existed in a legal grey area that couldn't persist indefinitely. Eventually, someone would ask questions that required official answers. "Then we'll fight for you," Tomás had said finally. "All of us. Together." It was a promise that he wasn't certain he could keep, but it was a promise that he meant with every fiber of his being. The wooden robin in Theo's pocket was proof that some things were worth fighting for, worth carving with careful attention, worth giving freely even when resources were scarce. As spring approached and the days grew longer, the robin became a talisman for all of Thea's symbol of hope, of renewal, of the faith that even the smallest acts of love could create something beautiful enough to last. The family photo captured a moment that none of them had seen coming. Mrs. W. Chen had been the one to notice it, the way they had all collapsed into laughter on the front porch after Theo's attempt to teach everyone. His stone-skipping technique had resulted in Elena falling fully clothed into the shallow end of the tide pool. The laughter had been spontaneous and contagious, the kind that builds on itself until everyone is helpless with it, and Mrs. Chen had snapped the picture with the quick reflexes of someone who recognized a moment worth preserving. In the photograph, they were a tangle of wet clothes and broad smiles. Tomás sat in the center, his arms encompassing all four children, his face reflecting a contentment that had been absent for too long. Sophia and Elena flanked him on one side, their matching grins showing the gap-toothed proof of recent visits from the tooth fairy. Iris and Theo completed the circle on the other side, their formal poses finally relaxed into the comfortable sprawl of children who had learned to take up space without permission. But it was what the photograph didn't show that made it most significant. It didn't show the 3 months of careful negotiation that had taught them to share bathroom time without bloodshed. It didn't show the countless small compromises that had transformed a house designed for 3 into a home that embraced 6. It didn't show the way they had all learned to sleep through Theo's occasional nightmares, or the way Iris had gradually stopped flinching when Tomás reached out to ruffle her hair. The picture had been taken on a Sunday in early April, during what had become their weekly beach expedition. These outings had evolved from the spontaneous tide pool adventure into a cherished family tradition, complete with packed lunches and elaborate planning sessions about which trails to explore and which rocks looked most promising for finding treasure. Elena had been the one to suggest they needed a real family photo. Something better than the school pictures that lined the hallway, something that showed all of them together. Mrs. Chen's candid shot had captured exactly what Elena had been hoping for, though none of them had realized it was being taken. The photograph now occupied a place of honor on the mantelpiece, flanked by individual school pictures and vacation snapshots that documented their gradual transformation from strangers to family. Visitors couldn't help but notice it, and their reactions had become a reliable barometer of community acceptance. Some people saw exactly what Mrs. Chen had captured: a family bound by love rather than biology, happiness that transcended traditional definitions of belonging. Others saw something more complicated, their smiles polite, but their questions pointed. Where were the children's real parents? What were the legal arrangements? How long was this temporary situation expected to last? Tomás had learned to navigate these conversations with practiced diplomacy, but they wore on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The questions weren't malicious. Most came from genuine concern for the children's welfare, but they served as constant reminders that their family's legitimacy was subject to external validation in ways that traditional families took for granted. The financial pressures had continued to mount, despite his careful budgeting and expanded work schedule. The children needed spring clothes, and 4 growing bodies meant sizes that seemed to change with each wash cycle. Iris had grown 3 inches since January and was rapidly approaching the point where Sophia's hand-me-downs would no longer fit. Theo had developed an alarming appetite that required constant attention to grocery shopping and meal planning. But it was the medical expenses that had created the most stress. Elena's annual checkup had revealed the need for glasesa, relatively minor expense, that nonetheless required careful rearrangement of the monthly budget. When Theo had developed an ear infection that required antibiotics, the pharmacy visit had consumed the money that Tomás had been saving for new work boots. The children had begun to notice his stress, responding with the particular sensitivity that comes to those who have learned to read adult moods for signs of changing weather. Iris had started making their school lunches with military efficiency, stretching ingredients to create meals that looked abundant while actually costing very little. Sophia had begun researching free activities in the local paper, presenting options for family entertainment that wouldn't strain their resources. Even Elena, usually oblivious to such practical concerns, had started saving her allowance money in a mason jar labeled Family Emergency Fund in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. It was during this period of financial juggling that Sarah Martinez had entered their lives. She was the new 3rd-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary, hired mid-semester to replace Mr. Peterson when he had taken early retirement for health reasons. Her arrival had created ripples of interest throughout the small community. Single, attractive, clearly educated, and possessed of the kind of warm authority that made children want to please her. Tomás had first encountered her during a parent-teacher conference about Theo's progress in mathematics. She had been effusive in her praise for his natural abilities, while gently suggesting that he might benefit from more challenging work. But it was her genuine interest in Theo as a persona, questions about his hobbies, his family situation, his adjustment to their expanded household, that had caught Tomás's attention. "He talks about you constantly," she had said with a smile that seemed to encompass more than professional interest. "The carpentry lessons, the beach expeditions, the way you help him with his reading. He clearly adores you." The conversation had been pleasant and professional, but Tomás had found himself thinking about it more than seemed appropriate. Sarah's questions had been perceptive, her suggestions practical, and her obvious affection for Theo had resonated with his own protective instincts. When she had appeared at Henderson's Market the following Saturday, their encounter had felt less like coincidence than like opportunity. She had been struggling with a heavy bag of groceries, and Tomás had instinctively offered to help carry them to her car. The conversation that had followed had been easy and natural, flowing from practical topics to personal ones, with the comfortable rhythm of people who discovered they had more in common than expected. Sarah was originally from Portland, had moved to Millbrook specifically for the teaching position, and was still learning to navigate small-town social dynamics. She lived in a small apartment above the bakery, spent her weekends exploring the coastal trails, and had confessed to feeling somewhat isolated despite the friendly reception she had received from the community. "It's hard to break into established social circles," she had said as they loaded her groceries into her compact car. "Everyone's been very welcoming, but they all have their own families, their own routines. I sometimes feel like I'm watching life happen rather than participating in it." Tomás had understood exactly what she meant. Even surrounded by his expanded family, he sometimes felt the loneliness of adult isolation blinks, the way parental responsibilities could create barriers to forming new relationships, especially romantic ones. The conversation had concluded with Sarah's invitation to coffee, casual, friendly, appropriate for two adults who had discovered they enjoyed each other's company. Tomás had accepted, but not without a complex mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The coffee date had been successful enough to warrant a second one, then a third. Sarah had proven to be intelligent, funny, and genuinely interested in his life with the children. She had listened to stories about their daily chaos with the engagement of someone who found family dynamics fascinating rather than overwhelming. But it was her interaction with the children themselves that had ultimately won Tomás's deeper interest. When he had finally introduced her to his expanded household, she had approached each child with the careful attention of someone who understood that earning their acceptance was more important than impressing the adults. She had complimented Sophia's organizational systems without condescension, had encouraged Elena's artistic projects with genuine enthusiasm, had engaged Theo in conversations about birds and mathematics with the focused attention of someone who valued his interests. Most importantly, she had treated Iris with the respect due to someone whose opinion mattered not as a child to be charmed, but as a young person whose protective instincts deserved acknowledgement. Iris's reaction had been cautiously positive. She had observed Sarah with the analytical precision she applied to all potential threats to their family's stability, looking for signs of insincerity or hidden agendas. But Sarah's consistent kindness and her obvious respect for their family's unique dynamics had gradually earned Iris's grudging approval. "She's not trying to replace anyone," Iris had announced after Sarah's third visit to their house. "She likes us the way we are." It was perhaps the highest praise that Iris could offer, and it had meant more to Tomás than any romantic declaration might have. The relationship had progressed slowly, carefully, with the deliberate pace of two adults who understood that their choices affected more than just themselves. Sarah had been patient with the complexities of dating a single father of four, had shown understanding when family obligations took precedence over romantic plans, had demonstrated genuine interest in becoming part of their lives rather than competing with them. But even as the relationship developed, the underlying stresses continued to mount. The photograph on the mantelpiece captured their happiness, but it couldn't address the practical realities that threatened to undermine it. Legal questions about custody and guardianship remained unresolved. Financial pressures continued to squeeze their monthly budget. And somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of the state system, records existed that noted the absence of two children who were supposed to be in institutional care. The picture showed them as they wanted to be seen. They had learned to see themselves, but it couldn't protect them from the external forces that might still tear their carefully constructed family apart. It could only serve as evidence of what they had built together, proof that love and commitment could create bonds strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. As spring moved towards summer and the days grew longer, the photograph became a talisman, for all of them visual proof that they belonged together, that their unconventional family was as real and as valuable as any that had been created through more traditional means. It was a reminder that some moments are worth preserving, some relationships are worth fighting for, and some families are worth everything it takes to keep them together. The legal summons arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, delivered by a process server who looked uncomfortable with his task and apologized twice before handing Tomás the official documents. The papers were thick, formal, weighted with bureaucratic language that transformed their family's joy into a legal problem requiring immediate resolution. Court appearance required. The covering letter stated in bold type, "In the matter of the custody and placement of minor children, Iris Caldwell and Theodore Caldwell, currently residing unlawfully with Tomás Rivera." The word unlawfully hit Tomás like a physical blow. Unlawfully. As if love were a crime, as if opening your home to children in need were a violation of some fundamental order. As if the laughter captured in Mrs. Chen's photograph were evidence of wrongdoing rather than right-doing. The children were at school when the summons arrived, which gave Tomás precious hours to process the implications before he had to explain to them that their worst fears were materializing with the inexorable power of official procedure. He sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by Maria's recipes and the normal detritus of family life, reading legal language that reduced their lives to case numbers and procedural violations. The complaint had been filed by Director Harwick from Millbrook Children's Home, who had discovered the children's absence from the state facility where they were supposed to have been transferred. His report painted Tomás as either a kidnapper or a well-meaning fool who had interfered with proper legal processes. The children were described as missing persons who had been unlawfully detained by someone who lacked proper authorization to provide their care. But the most devastating revelation came in the final paragraphs of the legal filing. Iris and Theo had a living relative, their father's brother, Marcus Caldwell, who had been located in Denver and who was now asserting his legal right to custody. According to the documents, Marcus had been contacted as part of the standard family reunification process that should have been completed before the children were placed in institutional care. The uncle's existence reframed everything. Tomás wasn't just fighting bureaucratic incompetence or institutional indifference. He was fighting biology, blood relationships, the fundamental legal presumption that family meant genetics rather than choice. The court date was set for 3 weeks away, barely enough time to find legal representation, much less to build a case that could compete with the straightforward argument of blood relation. Tomás found himself facing a legal system that would measure his 3 months of devoted care against Marcus Caldwell's biological claim and would likely find his love insufficient to overcome legal precedent. When the children came home from school that afternoon, they knew immediately that something had changed. Iris, ever alert to shifts in adult mood, had noticed the tension in Tomás's shoulders before she had even dropped her backpack. Theo had approached with the careful hesitation of someone who had learned to expect bad news. Sophia and Elena, less experienced with crisis, had simply asked why their father looked sad, their questions innocent and direct in the way that 8-year-old inquiries could be. Tomás had gathered all 4 children in the living room, sitting them down in the arrangement they had naturally developed for family meetings, Sophia and Elena on either side of him on the couch. Iris and Theo cross-legged on the floor but close enough to touch. The family photograph smiled down at them from the mantelpiece, a cruel reminder of the happiness that was now under legal threat. "There are some people who think you shouldn't be living here," he had begun, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that truth needed to be age-appropriate without being dishonest. Iris had stiffened, her body going into the defensive posture that Tomás had learned to recognize as her preparation for abandonment. "They're coming for us, aren't they?" The question had been asked with the resigned certainty of someone who had always known that good things were temporary. Iris had never fully relaxed into the security of their family. Some part of her had remained packed and ready for the next displacement. "There's going to be a court hearing," Tomás had explained. "A judge needs to decide what's best for you and Theo, And it turns out you have an uncle, your father's brother, who wants to take care of you. The revelation of Uncle Marcus had hit the children like a seismic shift. Theo had looked confused, trying to process the idea of family members he didn't remember. Elena had immediately declared that they already had a family and didn't need another one. Sophia had asked practical questions about who this uncle was and why he had never been in their lives before. But it was Iris who had understood the implications most clearly. "He's family," she had said, the word carrying the weight of legal inevitability. "Real family, blood family." "Your real family," Elena had protested, reaching across the space between couch and floor to grab Iris's hand. "You're our sister. Theo's our brother. That's real." The conversation that had followed had been one of the most difficult of Tomás's life. He had tried to explain legal concepts to children who thought love should be sufficient qualification for custody. He had attempted to describe bureaucratic processes to young people who measured relationships in shared meals and bedtime stories, rather than court orders and case files. The children's reactions had been as varied as their personalities. Sophia had immediately begun strategizing, asking about lawyers and legal procedures with the analytical precision she applied to every problem. Elena had dissolved into tears, clinging to Iris with the desperate grip of someone watching her world disintegrate. Theo had gone very quiet, his eyes wide with the particular terror of a 9-year-old who had just learned that adults could be forced to stop loving him. Iris had been the one to ask the hardest question: "What do we do?" It was a question that had no easy answer. Tomás had promised to fight for them, had assured them that they would face whatever came together, had insisted that their 3 months as a family had created bonds that couldn't be dissolved by legal documents. But privately, he had understood the magnitude of the challenge they were facing. The weeks that followed had been a whirlwind of legal preparation and emotional turmoil. Tomás had found a family law attorney, Susan Chen, Miss Chen's daughter, who had returned to Millbrook to practice law after years in Portland. She had taken their case with the passionate commitment of someone who had grown up knowing the Rivera family and who understood what was at stake. The legal strategy had been complex and multifaceted. They would argue that the children's best interests were served by remaining with the family they had chosen, that the stability and love they had found with Tomás outweighed the theoretical advantages of blood relation. They would document the children's academic progress, their emotional development, their integration into the community. But they would also have to confront the harsh reality that family courts generally favored biological relatives, especially when those relatives had not been given the opportunity to provide care in the first place. Marcus Caldwell's lawyers would argue that he had been deprived of his rightful role as guardian, that the children belonged with their father's family, that their current placement was the result of bureaucratic failure rather than deliberate choice. The community had rallied around them with the fierce loyalty that small towns reserve for their own. Mrs. Chen had organized a letter-writing campaign, recruiting teachers, neighbors, shopkeepers, and clergy to provide character references for Tomás and testimonials about the children's happiness and adjustment. Principal Davies had prepared detailed reports about their academic progress and social integration. Even the fisherman at the harbor had offered to testify about Theo's transformation from a frightened, withdrawn child to a confident, curious boy who had found his place in their informal community. But the support, while emotionally sustaining, couldn't change the fundamental legal reality they were facing. Blood relationships carried enormous weight in family court, especially when the biological relative appeared to be stable, employed, and genuinely interested in providing care. Marcus Caldwell had proven to be exactly that. The background checks had revealed a man in his 40s, unmarried, working as an engineer in Denver, with a clean legal record and adequate financial resources. He had never been contacted about his niece and nephew because of a bureaucratic oversight. The children's file had listed their father as an only child, missing the brother who had been estranged from the family for years before the parents' death. His sudden appearance in their lives would have been complicated under any circumstances, but his timing felt particularly cruel. He was claiming children who had spent years believing they had no family left, who had finally found stability and love, who had learned to trust that home could be permanent rather than temporary. The legal summons had transformed their house from a sanctuary into a battleground. Every shared meal now carried the weight of potential endings. Every bedtime story became a cherished memory that might have to last a lifetime. Every moment of ordinary family happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that their time together had become finite and precious. The family photograph on the mantelpiece had taken on new, significant just as documentation of their joy, but as evidence in a court case that would determine whether that joy was legally sustainable. It would be submitted to a judge who would be asked to weigh their chosen love against biological obligation, their 3 months of devoted care against 40 years of genetic connection. As the court date approached, they clung to each other with the desperate intensity of people who understood that everything they had built together was about to be subjected to the judgment of strangers who would measure their family's worth according to laws that had never been designed to protect relationships like theirs. The summons had changed everything, but it had also clarified everything. They were no longer simply a family learning to live together, they were a family fighting to stay together, and the fight would test every bond they had forged in the gentle months when love had been enough to overcome every obstacle except the law itself. The character reference letters arrived in a steady stream throughout the final week before the hearing, each envelope adding weight to the thick folder that Susan Chen had assembled to argue their case. The letters had been written by hands both young and old, on stationery both formal and humble, but each one carried the same essential message. The Rivera family belonged together, and separating them would be a tragedy disguised as legal procedure. Mrs. Patterson from Sophia's class had written 3 pages about Iris's protective instincts and academic achievements. Mr. Henderson from the market had submitted a brief but powerful statement about Theo's transformation from a frightened, withdrawn child to a confident young person who greeted customers with genuine warmth. Even the fishermen from the harbour had collaborated on a letter, their weathered signatures attesting to Theo's curiosity about their work and his natural kindness toward the sea creatures he encountered during their family beach expeditions. But it was the letter from Marcus, 6-year-old Marcus from the orphanage, the child whose defense had led to Iris and Theo's expulsion, that carried the most emotional weight. Written in careful first-grade handwriting with help from his new foster mother, it simply stated, "Iris and Theo saved me from the mean boys. They are good. They should stay with people who love them." Susan Chen had read each letter aloud to Tomás during their final preparation session, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the community's testimony. The law office conference room had been filled with evidence of their family's legitimacy: school reports, medical records, photographs, financial statements, but it was the letters that transformed legal arguments into human stories. "The judge will be impressed by the community support," Susan had said, organizing the documents with practiced efficiency. "But we need to be realistic about what we're facing. Marcus Caldwell's claim is straightforward. He's blood family, he's financially stable, and he was never given the opportunity to provide care. The burden of proof is on us to demonstrate that removing the children from your home would be harmful rather than beneficial." The strategy they had developed was complex and risky. They would argue that Iris and Theo had experienced significant trauma from multiple placements and that another disruption would cause psychological damage. They would present evidence of the children's academic and social progress in their current environment. Most importantly, they would ask the court to consider the children's own wishes about their placement. But the opposing argument was equally compelling. Marcus Caldwell's attorney would contend that blood family should take precedence over temporary arrangements, that the children deserved to know their genetic heritage, and that a stable uncle could provide advantages that even the most loving foster situation could not match. The children themselves had been included in the preparation process as much as their ages allowed. Iris, at 11, was old enough to understand the legal complexities and had been asked whether she wanted to testify on her own behalf. Her response had been characteristically direct. "Will it help us stay together?" When Susan had explained that her testimony could be influential but couldn't guarantee the outcome, Iris had nodded with the resignation of someone who had learned to hope cautiously. "Then I'll do it. But I'm scared." Theo had been deemed too young for formal testimony, but the court-appointed child advocate had interviewed him extensively about his preferences and experiences. His drawings from those sessions pictures of the Rivera family at the beach, around the dinner table, working together in Tomás's shop, would be submitted as evidence of his emotional attachment and sense of belonging. The week before, the hearing had been filled with the kinds of conversations that families have when they're facing potential separation. Promises were made and received with the desperate intensity of people who understood that their time together might be limited. Sophia and Elena had extracted commitments from Iris and Theo to write letters and visit during school holidays, as if geography were the only obstacle to maintaining their relationships. Tomás had spent long evenings with each child individually, trying to prepare them for outcomes that ranged from complete victory to devastating loss. With Sophia, he had discussed the practical realities of custody decisions and the importance of respecting legal processes even when they felt unjust. With Elena, he had focused on the permanence of love and the way that families could remain connected even when they couldn't remain together. His conversations with Iris and Theo had been the most difficult. Both children carried deep scars from previous abandonments, and the prospect of another separation had triggered defense mechanisms that Tomás had thought they had overcome. Iris had begun packing her belongings in small increments, as if preparing for inevitable displacement. Theo had started hoarding food in his dresser drawer, a behavior that hadn't surfaced since his first weeks in their home. "I need you to understand something," Tomás had said during one of their bedtime conversations, sitting on the edge of Theo's bed while Iris listened from her position near the window. "No matter what happens in court, you will always be my children. Legal papers can't change what we've built together." "But if we have to go live with Uncle Marcus," Theo had begun, his voice small and uncertain. "Then you'll still be my son," Tomás had interrupted gently. "And Iris will still be my daughter, and Sophia and Elena will still be your sisters. The judge can decide where you live, but nobody can decide who you love or who loves you." It was a comfort that felt insufficient in the face of potential separation, but it was the only comfort he could offer with complete honesty. Sarah had been a source of strength throughout the preparation period, her presence providing stability for both Tomás and the children. She had helped with the practical details of document preparation and had offered to testify about the children's integration into the school community. But more importantly, she had provided emotional support during the moments when the weight of potential loss had threatened to overwhelm them all. "Whatever happens," she had said during one of their quiet conversations after the children had gone to bed, "you've given them something precious. You've shown them what family can look like when it's based on choice rather than obligation. That's a gift they'll carry with them no matter where they end up." Her words had been meant to comfort, but they had also highlighted the possibility that Tomás was working so hard not to contemplate. If they lost the custody hearing, he would become a chapter in Iris and Theo's story, rather than a permanent part of their lives. The thought was almost unbearable. The community's support had been overwhelming but also bittersweet. The letter-writing campaign had demonstrated the depth of affection that the children had inspired in their brief time in Millbrook, but it had also served as a reminder of how much they would be missed if they were forced to leave. Mrs. Chen had organized a prayer circle that met each evening in her garden, neighbors taking turns, offering hope and comfort to a family facing an uncertain future. Principal Davies had approached the situation with the careful diplomacy of an educator who had seen many custody battles, but his personal investment was obvious. He had worked with both children daily, had watched them flourish academically and socially, and had become genuinely attached to their progress and potential. "I've seen a lot of placement situations over the years," he had told Tomás during one of their preparatory meetings. "Most of them involve children adapting to new environments. What you've created is different. You've created an environment that adapts to children. That's rare, and it's precious. The distinction had meant more to Tomás than almost anything else he had heard during the preparation process. The Rivera household had indeed been transformed by the addition of Iris and Theo, but the transformation had been organic and mutual. They hadn't simply absorbed two additional children into their existing structure. They had allowed their structure to evolve to embrace new possibilities. As the hearing date approached, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Normal routines continued, homework was completed, meals were shared, bedtime stories were read, but everything felt fragile and temporary. The family photograph still smiled from the mantelpiece, but it now carried the weight of evidence rather than simply joy. The night before the court date, they had held what Elena dubbed their Last Supper, though everyone had immediately protested the morbid terminology. It was meant to be a celebration of their time together, a way of honoring what they had built, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Sarah had joined them, and Mrs. Live, the Chen, had provided dessert, a chocolate cake decorated with 5 candles representing each member of their chosen family. The meal had been both joyful and heartbreaking. Stories were shared about their favorite memories: the first morning when Theo had helped make pancakes, the afternoon when Iris had taught Elena to braid friendship bracelets, the evening when Sophia had read bedtime stories to everyone because Tomás had been working late. Each memory was precious precisely because it might have to serve as a goodbye. But it was during the clean-up afterward that the most significant moment had occurred. Iris had been washing dishes with her characteristic precision when she had suddenly stopped, her hands still in the soapy water, her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "I don't want to leave," she had whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of running water. "I know I'm supposed to be grateful if Uncle Marcus wants us, and I know blood family is supposed to matter more, but I don't want to leave. This is home." It was the first time Iris had allowed herself to express the depth of her attachment, the first time she had admitted that their 3 months together had transformed her understanding of what family could mean. For a child who had learned to protect herself by remaining emotionally distant, the admission was both a breakthrough and a risk. Tomás had dried his hands and turned her around, looking into eyes that were wet with tears she had been holding back for weeks. "Then we'll fight," he had said simply. "Tomorrow we'll walk into that courtroom and we'll fight for our family, all of us together." The promise had been made not just to Iris but to all of Thema, commitment that they would face whatever came with unity and courage, that they would not surrender their bonds without a battle worthy of what they had built together. That night, sleep had been elusive for everyone. Tomás had found himself standing in the doorway of each child's room, watching them in the peaceful vulnerability of sleep, trying to memorize the sight of his children safe in their beds. Sophia and Elena had asked to sleep together, finding comfort in each other's presence during their first real experience with the possibility of family loss. Iris and Theo had whispered together long into the night, their quiet conversations a mixture of fear, hope, and mutual comfort. The morning of the hearing had dawned grey and drizzly, weather that seemed to match their collective mood. They had dressed in their best clothes, children in outfits that Sarah had helped them select, Tomás in the one suit he owned, which had been purchased for Maria's funeral and had remained in the closet ever since. Breakfast had been a quiet affair, everyone too nervous to eat much, despite Tomás's attempts to maintain normalcy. The character reference letters had been loaded into Susan Chen's briefcase, along with all the other evidence of their family's legitimacy. The community's hopes and prayers had been gathered into legal arguments and procedural strategies. As they prepared to leave for the courthouse, Mrs. Chen had appeared at their door with a small gift for each child, hand-carved wooden tokens that she had commissioned from Tomás's own workshop. Each token bore the child's initials and was attached to a simple chain that could be worn as a necklace. "No matter what happens today," she had said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "you'll always have something to remind you that you belong to each other. Family isn't just about who you live with, it's about who you carry in your heart." The tokens had been accepted with the solemnity due to talismans, each child fastening their necklace with the careful attention of someone preparing for battle. They were small things, simple things, but they carried the weight of community blessing and the promise that love could transcend legal decisions. The drive to the courthouse had been made in relative silence, each family member lost in their own thoughts and fears. The building itself had loomed ahead like a symbol of institutional authority, its granite facade imposing and impersonal. This was where their family's fate would be decided by strangers who would measure their love according to legal precedents and statutory requirements. As they walked up the courthouse steps together, their hands instinctively finding each other for comfort and support, they carried with them everything they had built in 3 months of shared meals, bedtime stories, and daily kindnesses. They carried the community's testimony, the evidence of their transformation, and the desperate hope that justice and love might for once align in their favor. The character reference letters were more than just documents. They were proof that families could be created through choice, as well as biology, that love could transcend legal categories, and that sometimes the most important relationships were the ones that people fought to preserve, rather than simply inherited by accident of birth. In a few hours, a judge would decide whether their chosen family was legally sufficient to overcome the claims of blood relation. The letters would be read, the arguments would be heard, and their future would be determined by the intersection of law and mercy, procedure and compassion. But regardless of the outcome, they would face it together, united by bonds that had been forged in daily acts of care and sealed by their willingness to fight for each other when fighting was the only option left. The gavel sat silent on Judge Harrison's bench, a small wooden hammer that would soon determine the fate of 5 people who had learned to call each other family. Its presence dominated the courtroom despite its modest size, representing the power of institutional decision-making over the most intimate aspects of human relationship. The courtroom itself was smaller than Tomás had expected, its wood paneling and fluorescent lighting creating an atmosphere that was both formal and oddly mundane. This was where their extraordinary story would be reduced to legal arguments and procedural requirements, where 3 months of shared love would be weighed against 40 years of genetic connection. Susan Chen sat at their table with the organized calm of someone who had fought many custody battles, her briefcase open to reveal the carefully assembled evidence of their family's legitimacy. Across the aisle, Marcus Caldwell's attorney shuffled through his own documents with the confident efficiency of someone arguing a straightforward case. The law, after all, generally favored blood relatives who could provide adequate care. Marcus Caldwell himself was nothing like what the children had imagined. Instead of the imposing figure their fears had created, he appeared nervous and uncomfortable. A middle-aged man, in an ill-fitting suit, who kept glancing toward Iris and Theo with expressions that seemed to mix obligation with genuine uncertainty. He was tall like their father had been, with the same dark hair that Iris inherited, but his face carried the soft pallor of someone who spent his days in office buildings rather than the weathered resilience that Tomás had developed through years of physical work. When Judge Harrison entered the courtroom, everyone rose with the automatic respect that legal ritual required. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of measured demeanor that suggested she had presided over many cases where emotion and law intersected in complicated ways. Her eyes, when they surveyed the assembled parties, seemed to carry both authority and compassion, a combination that offered hope while promising nothing. "This is a custody hearing regarding minor children Iris Caldwell, age 11, and Theodore Caldwell, age 9, Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying clearly through the small courtroom. "The court will determine the most appropriate placement for these children, considering all relevant factors including their safety, stability, and best interests." The opening statements laid out the fundamental conflict with stark clarity. Marcus Caldwell's attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Jennifer Walsh, argued that biological family relationships carried presumptive legal weight, that the children belonged with their father's brother, who had been denied the opportunity to provide care due to bureaucratic oversight, and that continued placement with non-relatives violated both legal precedent and the children's right to know their genetic heritage. Mr. Caldwell is a stable, employed adult with no criminal record and adequate financial resources, Walsh stated, her voice carrying the confidence of someone presenting what should be a winning argument. He has expressed genuine desire to provide care for his brother's children and to give them the family connection they have been denied. The current placement, while well-intentioned, lacks legal foundation and denies these children their rightful place within their biological family. Susan Chen's opening response had been more complex, acknowledging the legal weight of biological relationships while arguing for the primacy of the children's demonstrated well-being. Your Honor, these children have experienced significant trauma from multiple placements and separations. They have found stability, love, and community integration in their current home. To remove them now would constitute another traumatic disruption, particularly given their strong attachment to their current family and their clear preferences about their placement. The first witness had been Director Harrick from Millbrook Children's Home, whose testimony was meant to establish the circumstances that had led to Iris and Theo's current situation. His account of their expulsion had been factually accurate but emotionally sterile, describing their violent behavior and inability to adapt to institutional rules without acknowledging the protective instincts that had motivated their actions. Under cross-examination, Susan Chen had methodically dismantled Harrick's characterization of the children as problematic, forcing him to admit that they had never been violent toward vulnerable residents, that their academic performance had been exemplary, and that their behavioral issues had consisted primarily of protecting younger children from bullying. Would you characterize standing up for a 6-year-old child as inherently violent behavior? Susan had asked, her voice carrying just enough edge to highlight the moral dimensions of the question. Harrick's uncomfortable response that rules needed to be enforced, regardless of motivation, had painted him as more concerned with institutional control than child welfare, potentially undermining his credibility as a witness. The testimony that followed had begun to build the case for the Rivera family's legitimacy. Principal Davies had spoken eloquently about both children's academic progress and social integration, their transformation from withdrawn newcomers to confident, engaged students who had become valued members of their school community. In 30 years of education, Davies had testified, I have rarely seen children flourish as dramatically as Iris and Theo have in their current placement. Their emotional stability, academic achievement, and social development have all improved markedly. They have found not just shelter, but genuine belonging. Mrs. Patterson, Sophia's teacher, had provided specific examples of Iris's protective relationship with her new siblings, describing instances where she had helped younger children with homework, had intervened to prevent playground conflicts, and had demonstrated the kind of mature empathy that suggested deep emotional security. But it was Mrs. Chen's testimony that had carried the most emotional weight. The elderly woman had spoken with the authority of someone who had raised 5 children of her own and had observed countless families over decades of community involvement. Her description of watching the Rivera household transform into something larger and more loving than its original configuration had painted a picture of organic family growth rather than artificial arrangement. I have watched this family become itself, she had said, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. Not Mr. Rivera taking in 2 charity cases, not 2 children adapting to a temporary situation, but 5 people discovering that they belonged together. That kind of authentic family bond cannot be created through legal documents. It can only be recognized and protected by them. The mourning had concluded with character witnesses from throughout the community, teachers, neighbors, shopkeepers, and clergy who had observed the children's integration and the family's obvious devotion to each other. Each testimony had added another layer to the argument that love and stability mattered more than biological connection, that these children had found their rightful place, even if that place didn't conform to traditional family structures. Marcus Caldwell's attorney had cross-examined each witness with professional thoroughness, but her questions had seemed to acknowledge the strength of community support while attempting to refocus attention on legal rather than emotional considerations. Her strategy appeared to be conceding that the Rivera placement had been beneficial while arguing that it remained legally insufficient compared to the biological uncle's claim. As the morning session ended and they broke for lunch, Tomás found himself cautiously optimistic about their presentation. The community's testimony had been powerful, the children's progress had been well documented, and Judge Harrison had listened with the kind of attention that suggested genuine consideration rather than perfunctory processing. Theo's testimony began with his small hand resting on a children's Bible, his 9-year-old voice barely audible as he promised to tell the truth. Judge Harrison had leaned forward in her chair, her expression gentle as she addressed the boy who would help determine his own fate. "Theo, I know this is scary," she had said, her formal judicial tone softening to accommodate a child who was being asked to participate in proceedings far beyond his years. "I just want to ask you a few questions about where you live and how you feel about your family. Is that okay?" Theo had nodded, his eyes finding Tomás in the gallery before returning to the judge. His wooden token necklace was visible above his collar, a small reminder of community blessing that seemed to give him courage. "Can you tell me about your house?" Judge Harrison had asked. "What's it like living with the Rivera family?" The question had opened a floodgate of innocent testimony that was more powerful than any legal argument. Theo had described their morning routines, the way Tomás helped him with reading, while Sophia organized everyone's school supplies. He had talked about beach expeditions and carpentry lessons, about Elena teaching him to draw horses and Iris showing him how to braid friendship bracelets. "Tomás teaches me about birds," Theo had said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about topics that mattered to him. "He carved me a robin because he said I watch things carefully like birds do. And Sophia helps me with math because she's really smart. And Elena always shares her snacks, even when I forget mine." "What about Iris?" Judge Harrison had asked gently. "How do you feel about your sister?" Theo's face had brightened with the particular glow that children reserve for their most beloved people. "Iris takes care of me. She always has, ever since our mom and dad died. She's the best sister in the whole world, and now I have 3 sisters instead of just 1. The mathematics of love, as calculated by a 9-year-old, had been both simple and profound. He hadn't lost anything by joining the Rivera family. He had gained siblings, parents, community, belonging. The idea that this expansion of love might be taken away seemed to genuinely confuse him. Marcus Caldwell's attorney had approached Theo's cross-examination with appropriate gentleness, but her questions had been designed to plant seeds of doubt about his current placement and curiosity about his biological family. "Theo, do you know anything about your daddy's family?" Walsh had asked. "About your Uncle Marcus, who's here today?" Theo had glanced toward Marcus with polite curiosity rather than recognition. "I don't remember him," he had said honestly. "I don't remember much about before Iris and me came to live with Tomás. Would you like to learn about your daddy's family, about where you came from?" It was a leading question that any adult would have recognized as manipulative, but Theo had considered it with the serious attention he gave to all adult inquiries. "I guess so," he had said finally, "but I already know where I come from. I come from Iris taking care of me, and then both of us coming to live with Tomás and Sophia and Elena. That's my family story." The simplicity of his response had undercut the attorney's attempt to suggest that biological heritage mattered more than lived experience. Theo's family story began with love and protection, not with genetics and legal relationships. When Theo had been excused, he had walked directly to Tomás rather than returning to the gallery, accepting the offered hug with the naturalness of a child seeking comfort from his father. The gesture had been spontaneous and telling under stress. Theo instinctively turned to the man who had become his primary source of security and guidance. Iris's testimony had been more complex, her 11-year-old sophistication allowing for deeper questioning about her experiences and preferences. She had spoken with the careful precision of someone who understood that her words carried enormous weight, that this might be her only opportunity to advocate for the life she wanted. "I know Uncle Marcus is our real family," she had begun, preempting the argument she knew would be made against her preferences. "I know blood family is supposed to be more important, but Tomás and Sophia and Elena are real family too. They chose us when nobody else wanted us. They didn't have to love us, but they did anyway." Her testimony had painted a picture of children who had found not just shelter, but genuine belonging, who had been transformed from survival mode into flourishing mode by adults who had seen their potential rather than their problems. "Before we came to live with them, I had to take care of Theo all by myself," Iris had continued, her voice steady despite the emotion underlying her words. "I had to make sure he ate enough and did his homework and didn't get picked on. I was tired all the time because I was trying to be his mum and his sister and his protector all at once." Judge Harrison had listened with visible attention as Iris described the burden of premature responsibility, the way that institutional life had forced her to become an adult before she had finished being a child. "But now I can just be his sister," Iris had said, and for the first time her composure had cracked slightly. "Tomás takes care of both of us, so I don't have to worry all the time. I can do homework and read books and play with Elena without always watching to make sure Theo is okay. I can be 11 years old instead of trying to be a grown-up." The distinction had been crucial. The Rivera family hadn't just provided care, they had provided the opportunity for age-appropriate development, for children to be children rather than miniature adults struggling with responsibilities beyond their capacity. Under cross-examination, Walsh had tried to suggest that Iris's attachment to her current family was based on gratitude rather than genuine preference, that she might feel differently about biological family if given the opportunity to develop those relationships. "Iris, don't you think you and Theo deserve to be with family who's related to you by blood, who can tell you stories about your father and help you understand where you come from?" Iris had considered the question with visible thoughtfulness before responding with devastating honesty. "I think we deserve to be with family who loves us every day, not just because they're supposed to. Uncle Marcus seems nice, but he's a stranger. Tomás isn't a stranger anymore. He's my dad." The word dad had hung in the courtroom air like a declaration of independence. Iris hadn't been coached to say. It had emerged from her own understanding of relationships that had transcended legal categories to become authentic emotional bonds. The final testimonies had come from the adults whose lives had been most directly affected by the custody decision. Marcus Caldwell had spoken briefly about his desire to honor his brother's memory by caring for his children, about his regret at not being involved in their lives earlier, about his belief that family should stay together. His testimony had been sincere but abstract, focused on obligation and principle rather than specific knowledge of or relationship with the children he wanted to claim. When asked about Iris and Theo's personalities, interests, or needs, his responses had been generic rather than personal. He knew they were good students and well-behaved children, but he didn't know that Theo collected smooth stones or that Iris read 3 grade levels above her age. Tomás's testimony had been the emotional crescendo of the hearing. He had spoken about the night the children had appeared on his doorstep, about the gradual process of becoming a family, about the ways that loving them had helped him heal from his own grief while giving them the stability they had never known. "They didn't just join our family," he had said, his voice thick with emotion. "They completed it. Sophia and Elena are better siblings because of Iris and Theo. I'm a better father because of them. We're all better people because we found each other." But it was his promise that had sealed his testimony with the kind of commitment that legal documents couldn't capture. "If you let them stay with us, I will spend the rest of my life making sure they know they're wanted, they're loved, and they belong. Not because I have to, but because I get to." As the testimony concluded, and both attorneys prepared their closing arguments, the courtroom had filled with the weight of decision. The gavel would soon fall, determining whether love would be sufficient to overcome law, where the chosen family would be recognized as legitimate as biological family, where the 5 people who had found each other would be allowed to stay together. The evidence was complete, the arguments had been made, and now their fate rested in the hands of a judge who would have to decide what was truly in the best interests of 2 children who had already lost so much and finally found so much worth keeping. The adoption certificate was printed on heavy cream paper with an official seal that caught the late afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. Judge Harrison held it carefully as she read the final declaration that would transform their legal status from temporary arrangement to permanent family. The document represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with 2 desperate children on a doorstep and had evolved into something that transcended every legal category designed to define family relationships. By the power vested in me by the state of Maine, Judge Harrison had announced 6 months earlier during their custody hearing, I hereby grant temporary custody of Iris Caldwell and Theodore Caldwell to Tomás Rivera, with the recommendation that permanent adoption proceedings begin immediately if all parties remain in agreement. The decision had been based on the judge's determination that the children's best interests were served by remaining with the family they had chosen and who had chosen them. Marcus Caldwell's biological claim had been acknowledged and respected, but it had been weighed against the evidence of genuine family bonds that had formed through daily acts of love rather than genetic accident. The months that had followed had been filled with legal procedures, social worker visits, and bureaucratic requirements that seemed designed to test their commitment to each other. But each hurdle had been met with the united determination of people who understood that they were fighting for something precious and irreplaceable. Now, on a crisp October morning, almost a year after Iris and Theo had first knocked on their door, the Rivera family gathered in Judge Harrison's chambers for the formal adoption ceremony. The same gavel that had once threatened their unity now served to make their bonds legally unbreakable. Iris and Theodore Caldwell Rivera. Judge Harrison said, using their new hyphenated names for the first time in an official capacity, you are hereby adopted by Tomás Rivera, with all the rights and responsibilities that adoption entails. You are now, in the eyes of the law as well as in your hearts, a permanent family. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by their chosen family and the community members who had supported them through their legal battle. Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her weathered hands trembling slightly with emotion. Sarah sat beside Tomás, her own eyes bright with tears of joy for the family she had come to love as her own. Sophia and Elena had insisted on wearing matching dresses for the occasion, their excitement palpable as they finally heard their siblings' new names spoken with legal authority. The friendship bracelets they all wore had faded over the months, but they remained symbols of bonds that had proven stronger than bureaucracy, more lasting than legal challenges. The adoption certificate would be framed and hung in the hallway beside school pictures and family photos, but its real significance lay not in its official language, but in the security it provided. Iris would never again have to fear that loving too deeply might lead to inevitable loss. Theo would never again have to pack his stones in preparation for another displacement. Sophia and Elena would never again have to wonder if their expanded family was too good to be permanent. The celebration that evening had filled their cottage with laughter and the warm chaos of community joy. Neighbors had brought covered dishes and homemade desserts, creating an impromptu feast that spilled from the kitchen into the living room and out onto the front porch. The house that had once seemed crowded with 5 people now felt perfectly sized for the extended family of friends, neighbors, and chosen relatives who had supported them through their journey. Mrs. Chen had presented each child with updated wooden tokens, now engraved with their new names and the date of their adoption. Family is not something you're born into, she had announced as she fastened the new necklaces around their necks. It's something you build, one day at a time, one act of love at a time. The sentiment had been echoed throughout the evening as people shared stories about the Rivera family's evolution, about watching 5 individuals slowly become a unified whole. Principal Davies had spoken about the children's continued academic progress and their roles as leaders and protectors of younger students. Mr. Henderson had described Theo's development from a shy boy who barely spoke to a confident young person who had convinced him to add a new flavor of penny candy based on customer research. But it was the children themselves who had provided the evening's most meaningful moments. Sophia had read a poem she had written about chosen families and the mathematics of love that multiplied rather than divided when shared among more people. Elena had performed a song she had learned in music class, her clear voice carrying lyrics about home being wherever your family gathered. Iris had offered a toast that demonstrated the remarkable young woman she was becoming. To Tomás, who opened his door when we had nowhere else to go, she had said, raising her glass of apple cider with the solemnity of someone speaking from deep gratitude. To Sophia and Elena, who shared their dad and their home and their hearts. To everyone who wrote letters and said prayers and believed that we belonged together, thank you for teaching us that family is something you choose every day. Theo had concluded the celebration with a presentation of his latest carving projector wooden plaque for their front door that read, "The Rivera family, Thomas, Sophia, Elena, Iris, and Theodore." The sign was imperfect, bearing the marks of 9-year-old craftsmanship, but it proclaimed their unity with the pride of someone who had finally found his permanent place in the world. As the guests gradually departed and the house settled into evening quiet, the 5 members of the Rivera family had gathered in the kitchen for their traditional after-celebration cleanup. It was a routine they had developed over months of shared celebrations, a way of processing joy together while returning their space to its normal state. But tonight felt different. Tonight, they moved through their tasks with the satisfied exhaustion of people who had achieved something significant together. The legal uncertainties that had shadowed their daily life for months had finally been resolved. The questions about their legitimacy as a family had been answered definitively. The fears about separation had been replaced by the security of legal permanence. So what happens now? Elena had asked as they finished loading the dishwasher, her question carrying the curiosity of someone who had grown accustomed to dramatic changes and was wondering what normal life might look like. "Now we keep being a family," Tomás had answered, pulling all 4 children into a group hug that had become their signature gesture of unity. "We get up tomorrow morning and make breakfast together. We argue about bathroom time and homework. We go to school and work and come home to each other. We do all the ordinary things that families do when they're not fighting for the right to stay together." The prospect of ordinary family life had never seemed more appealing. For children who had spent years in survival mode, the promise of routine and predictability was a gift more precious than any legal document. For a father who had feared losing them, the certainty of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow was a blessing beyond measure. That night, as Tomás made his traditional rounds to check on each child before bed, he found small signs of the security that legal adoption had provided. Iris had unpacked books that had remained in boxes since their arrival, finally confident that she would be staying long enough to arrange them on shelves. Theo had added new details to his hand-drawn map of Millbrook, marking favorite locations with the careful attention of someone planning to remain in place long enough to explore them all. Sophia and Elena had collaborated on a new bedroom arrangement that provided more space for the art supplies and collections that had accumulated over months of sisterhood. Their room hummed with the comfortable clutter of children who felt secure enough to spread out, to claim space, to make long-term plans. The cottage itself seemed to exhale with relief, its walls now legally as well as emotionally encompassing 5 people who belonged together. The kitchen table that had been expanded to accommodate everyone now felt appropriately sized rather than crowded. The bathroom schedule that had once required military precision now flowed with the natural rhythm of people who had learned to share space gracefully. But perhaps most significantly, the family photograph on the mantelpiece had been joined by other pictures from the adoption ceremony, candid shots from their celebration, images that documented their journey from temporary arrangement to permanent commitment. The collection told the story of people who had found each other against all odds and had fought to stay together against institutional resistance. As autumn deepened into winter and their first anniversary approached, the Rivera family settled into the comfortable rhythms of people who no longer had to prove their legitimacy to anyone. They were simply a family complex, loving, sometimes chaotic, always committed to each other's well-being and happiness. The adoption certificate in its frame served as legal proof of what their hearts had known from the beginning, that love was the most reliable foundation for family, that commitment was stronger than genetics, and that home was not a place, but a group of people who chose each other every day and never stopped choosing. In the end, they had created something that transcended every category designed to define family relationships. They had become what they had always been meant to be, not a collection of individuals sharing space, but a unified whole that was stronger and more beautiful than the sum of its parts. They had become home to each other, and that homecoming was worth every battle they had fought to preserve it.